Since they had been driven back home, they had been waiting nervously for the counter-invasion everyone knew was coming. But then, the counter-invasion just sort of didn't happen. Between the war in Britain and the Emperor's illness, the Romans had stayed put on their side of the Rhine, and so the Alemanni poked their heads up and decided to see what the deal was. By the end of 367, the Germans decided that the coast might actually be clear, and so they up and sacked the fortified city of Mainz. Valentinian's blood had to be boiling at this point, but there was little he could do about it just yet. He did, however, manage to exact a small measure of vengeance by arranging for the assassination of one of the leading anti-Roman Alemanni kings. That was at least something. In the spring of 368, Valentinian was finally ready to do a whole lot more. Probably right around the time Theodosius was setting off for Britain, the emperor personally led the Rhine legions across the river to pay the Alemanni back for all the trouble they had caused him. This time, he would not be delegating the job to subordinates. Like I said, the policy of utilizing subordinate generals to do the actual fighting was not completely entrenched yet. And besides, this was supposed to be a stomp and mash campaign against a weakened opponent, not a by-the-skin-of-the-teeth attempt to turn back an enemy who had momentum. But though it started out as the bloody walk in the park it was supposed to be, it quickly turned into one of those by-the-skin-of-their-teeth campaigns that very nearly cost Valentinian not just his throne, but his life. With his son Gratian along for the ride, things started out well for the Romans. The Alemanni were quick to run and hide whenever the legions came near, and Valentinian seized or burned whatever the Germans left behind. So far, so good. This'll teach them to mess with us, etc., etc. But then suddenly, a little bit south of the modern city of Heidelberg, the Alemanni grouped for a massive counterattack. We know almost nothing about the ensuing battle, except that it was a huge affair, closely contested until the very end, and that in the midst of the chaos, Valentinian was very nearly killed in the fighting. The Romans emerged from the battle victorious, but the emperor determined that they were too weak to continue the campaign. With both sides exhausted, a temporary truce was agreed to, and Valentinian withdrew to Trier to recuperate and plan his next move. Far from pursuing a policy of peaceful coexistence, though, Valentinian's next move would all but guarantee that as soon as everyone's wounds were healed up, that the fighting would begin all over again. Before we go this week, I'd like to take a second to revise and extend my remarks about Valentinian's early career. The whole period is a mess of confused chronology and conflicting details, and I inadvertently missed a whole alternate version of Valentinian's pre-imperial service. This version is based primarily on Ammianus Marcellinus' account, which states that Valentinian was not promoted into Constantius' army around 360 AD, but rather that he was discharged from the service in 357 after being falsely accused of cowardice. Cowardice? Really? Yes, really. Remember that band of Germans that Barbatio had failed to stop while Julian was campaigning in Gaul? Well, he pinned all of that on two of his tribunes, one of whom turned out to be Valentinian. This version of history thus implies that the future emperor did not in fact fight at the Battle of Strasbourg, like I said he likely did. Beyond this, Walter Roberts of Emory University argues that Valentinian was not recalled to the army by his old general Julian at all, and that the future emperor was only reinstated to service after Jovian was in power. According to this version, Valentinian was then assigned to the somewhat dangerous mission of telling the troops of the Western Empire that their beloved Julian was dead. It was in gratitude for this service that Jovian promoted Valentinian to his fateful... From there, I think we got back on firmer footing. These are minor details in the big picture, but if it's true, then this version does undercut some of what I said about Julian not caring that his officers were Christian so long as they were good at their jobs. I think the point still stands, but Valentinian may not have been the best example to use. Okay, next week we'll dive more into the now perpetually chaotic western half of the empire. War with the Germans would continue as a result of Valentinian's provocations, and one Alemanni king in particular will wind up driving the emperor absolutely crazy. Meanwhile, Africa will go to hell in a handbasket after years of misrule, and poor Theodosius the Elder, after proving himself to be one of the most capable officers in the army, will be executed following the sneaky dealings of sneaky courtiers. Like everything else during these years, events are badly dated, and who was doing what when is a difficult thing to nail down. I'm going to do my best to wade through the mess, but I reserve the right to revise and extend my remarks as circumstances dictate. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 150, The Perils of Mismanagement. In the winter of 368 AD, Valentinian was in the northern capital of Trier, making plans to overhaul the fortifications of the Rhine frontier. The whole region had been a disrupted mess since the revolt of Magnentius back in 350, and though Julian had done much to restore order, since the apostate emperor had gone east to meet his destiny, the west had slipped back into chaos. This was partly due to the increasing entropy of the time, but it was also due to Valentinian's own mishandling of the situation. Now that things in Britannia were back in hand and the Alemanni had been defeated in battle, the emperor was of a mind that it was time to re-cement Roman power. The only problem was that Valentinian's plan was so aggressive that it had the exact opposite effect. When the spring of 369 arrived, Valentinian ordered his troops to begin repairing and rebuilding various forts along the Roman side of the Rhine, which, so far, so good. But then the emperor took the provocative step of ordering his men to build a fort on the far side of the river, near the spot where the Romans and Alemanni had fought the year before, just south of the modern city of Heidelberg. Envoys from the Alemanni immediately protested the existence of a permanent Roman base in their territory, and they asked for an audience with Valentinian. But, as was the emperor's apparent custom, this request was denied. Once again, the Alemanni left the imperial court furious and hot for blood. Where there had just been a tentative peace, there was now once again a pretext for war. The new leader of the Alemanni, a wily king named Macrianus, quickly organized a strike force that began attacking the soldiers working on the offending base until the Romans were driven off and the half-built fort was destroyed. This, of course, ticked Valentinian off something fierce, but after his near-death experience at the end of 368, he was wary of just up and invading Alemanni territory again, at least not without stacking the deck a little. So in 370, he presented a plan to the Burgundians, another German confederation who lived a little bit deeper into the interior of Germania. They were already enemies of the Alemanni, and so Valentinian suggested that they just do what he knew they wanted to do, which was go on the offensive against their neighbors. Valentinian promised to support the effort, and implied that once battle was joined, that the Romans would cross over and attack the Alemanni from the rear. But though the supplies were promised, the whole bit about joining in the fight was merely implied. When the Burgundian envoys pressed for a guarantee, the Romans were reluctant to provide it. So the Burgundians asked for an audience with Valentinian, but as was now standard operating procedure, they were refused. Annoyed by this rebuke, and without much to go on but the manipulative prodding of the Romans, the Burgundians returned home, declining to raise a hand against the Alemanni. But the talks did turn out to stack the deck just a little in Rome's favor. When the Alemanni caught wind of a possible Roman-Burgundian alliance, they decided the most prudent response would be to scatter. When Valentinian heard that the Alemanni forces were decentralized, he immediately prepared for another invasion. This one to be led by the emperor's newly minted master of the horse and all-around Mr. Fix-It, Theodosius the Elder. Theodosius had come back from Britannia at the end of 369 and was now clearly the one man Valentinian had confidence in, a confidence that he would prove himself worthy of over and over again. At some point in 371 or 372, Theodosius gathered up an army in the province of Raetia, and then crossed over into Alemanni territory. With no one part of the scattered German confederation large enough to fend off the Roman advance, Theodosius was able to sweep through the territory, rounding up hordes of prisoners in the process. These prisoners were then deposited in the Po Valley of northern Italy, where, in return for their lives, they were to become settled farmers and willing recruits for the Roman army. In the midst of this campaign, Theodosius nearly captured Macrianus, but the Alemanni king managed to slip away. But that did not stop Theodosius from imposing a new order on the Germans. A pro-Roman chieftain was raised up, and the other Alemanni nobles were forced to submit to his supremacy. It was holding no real force once the Romans withdrew, but it was some nice wrapping paper around a very successful campaign season for Theodosius. Though this would not be the end of the wars against the Alemanni, this was enough of a settlement for Valentinian that the emperor thought it safe to transfer his Mr. Fix-It down to North Africa, which had suddenly become the new crisis center of the Western Empire. Apparently, some kind of revolt had broken out, and there were conflicting reports coming in about what was really going on, who was fighting for what, and who was to blame. At the center of the maelstrom was Romanus, the dukes of the North African legions, who is unquestionably the villain of this story. Romanus was exactly the sort of greedy nihilist that you just really want in a high-ranking position of authority in a territory that you are just barely holding on to. He was a disaster. Without him around, I doubt any of what's about to happen would have happened. Above and beyond the petty corruption that usually accumulates around ethically challenged leaders, Romanus had developed a truly sinister means of enriching himself. Once the various municipalities of North Africa had paid all their taxes and sent along all the required conscripts to fill the ranks of the army, Romanus would go around and ask for more money and more men. If the municipalities balked, then Romanus would hint darkly that, should Moorish raiders attack your city, my men might be too occupied to come help you. But if you pay up, then I'll make sure we come running. Most of the cities gave in to this blackmail, but there were a few who refused. And this is where things get ugly. You see, Romanus wasn't bluffing. He used his contacts with various Moor tribes to hint to them that if they were planning on attacking such and such a city, that it was highly likely the legions would be occupied elsewhere and not make it in time to stop them.